Awesome. Cool. Hey everyone, good afternoon. My name is Sam. My pronouns are they, them, and I am the member experience manager here at Advent Coworking, a creative co-working community, event space, podcast studio, wellness center, art gallery, really a community. And thank you so much for joining us today for our Advent Member Talk. This is a weekly event that we put on every Tuesday from 4:30 to 5. Each week features a different Advent member on the topic of their choosing, sometimes related to their industry, sometimes just related to their passions. So I'm really excited today that we're being joined by Rob, who's going to be speaking to us about affordable housing. Definitely a 101, because there's so much to cover. But if you have any questions for Rob, please type those into the comments and we will have a short Q&A at the end. So Rob, I will hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Sam. Good afternoon, Advent co-working family and others who may be present. I am going to pull my slides up here that I'll share as I go along. Let's put this in view mode. Okay. So again, good afternoon. I'm Rob Hammock, and I'm grateful for that introduction by Sam. And I'm really happy to be able to share this talk this afternoon. In my case, it's both a passion and work related, as I'll be talking about affordable housing sort of 101 today. My goal is to, after this time, give you a little bit better of an idea of what affordable housing is, the various layers that go with it, why our community needs it, and why it's so hard to find. And lastly, I'd add another part there at the end about, and what can you do about it? So with that, I'll give you a little bit more of a background in me in terms of, just who I am, but why does affordable housing matter to me? And then also into my own personal journey of how this developed for me career-wise. I'm a son of a banker, which means I have a love of math that I got from my dad and understanding finance. I'm the grandson of a single family home builder. So I had an early love of housing and appreciating when I would get to go to visit him and be on site. There's something about the smell of freshly sawn wood that I would always love when I'd have a chance to go visit him. But growing up on the south side of Chicago, so this is important to me. I grew up actually in the city. My family is originally all from Georgia, but my dad went to graduate school in Chicago and they stayed. And fortunately for me, we actually lived in the city on the south side. And so I grew up going to Chicago public school system for approximately 10 years. And why that's important to me and as part of my journey in this conversation is Chicago public school system. I went to some very diverse schools, which I'm realizing the older I am, the more unlikely that is for others to have had that experience. My elementary school was approximately 50% Black, 50% white. And the high school I went to in Chicago for a couple of years was approximately 75% Black, 15% white, and about 10% Hispanic and Asian. And being able to have that experience allowed me to come into contact with people from much different ethnic and racial backgrounds, but also income groupings. And this is where I realized the privilege I had early on with my dad being in banking, working in management, downtown Chicago, but then also because I played sports. That was how everybody in the neighborhood, especially the boys, got to know each other, playing our neighborhood basketball court, playing baseball. And through my experience in team sports, that I came to know guys that lived in much different situations than I did. Some who lived in lower income neighborhoods, some that would have been considered living in public housing projects. But as opposed to coming at affordable housing from a perspective of, oh, that's what housing for those people who need affordable housing, it was, well, these are my friends. And I understood early on, at least what my privilege was and the opportunity I had to look at how can I make the lives of my friends better. And this was furthered by the work of my church that I grew up in. This was an important part of who I was. And we had a church that was active, and we had a sister church that was trying to take on affordable housing for its neighborhood just a little further on the south side. And it was involved in my dad's bank. As a result of that, I saw early on understanding the need for affordable housing because there just wasn't enough of it. And also just a lot of the challenges and how also that related to other issues of economic mobility and educational inequity, which if you've been in Charlotte for any amount of time these last few years, knowing that those are two issues that have increasingly come to the fore. And the role that affordable housing plays for access to educational equity and educational or an economic mobility, certainly it's a holistic need for all of these to be able to come together and for us to make some headway on these issues. For me specifically, with those opportunities, I went on to school, was a public policy major. I later then went on to seminary thinking I might actually be a pastor. But what I realized is I actually really appreciated the opportunity to work in what I would consider sort of an urban ministry context and working with groups that were doing housing. It was Habitat for Humanity or other faith-based housing developers. As a result, I had the opportunity to work with organizations that were faith-based groups doing affordable housing where I went to seminary in New Jersey. And it was from that it was initially for the purpose of helping to raise funds from other private, philanthropic, and faith-based entities to do the work that I realized I really enjoyed the project side of how can I work with nonprofit organizations who were trying to better their communities, but maybe they needed more financial expertise than they had locally, or they needed help in bridging those gaps between their neighborhoods and finance. And this is where the son of a banker and grandson of a home builder came to play. And so through that internship I had in seminary, I worked with a loan fund, then it's called New Jersey Community Capital, that specifically worked with local nonprofits, building affordable housing, building childcare centers, or other multi-purpose facilities. And so for the last 20 years, I have done that primarily through working with two large national nonprofits that specialize in working with local affordable housing developers. About a year and a half ago, the last one I worked with, NeighborWorks Capital, based out of DC, but we had a portfolio from Maine to Florida to California. I'd gotten a little bit too tired of the traveling, and so I had the opportunity to try and refocus my efforts to come to Charlotte. I've been consulting on my own for the last year and a half. Thankfully for me, my prior employer is still one of my largest consulting contracts, and so that has helped to continue the work I do. But what that boils down to right now is I have three primary focuses within the practice that I've been developing. One is with affordable housing and community development finance. Really, that's working on the real estate side as nonprofits are trying to find property that they're looking to develop. Whether I'm working with a nonprofit that is trying to help develop the property, pull the financing together, or a lot of my work was with community development loan funds. So coming in as a lender perspective to help enable those local groups. Nonprofit and finance management. This is more generalized to the nonprofit sector, where my background being I was the chief credit officer of this prior entity, being able to do a deep dive and look into and understanding the operations of a nonprofit and how that fits into their business model. I currently am on a finance committee of a local nonprofit here, helping them to build out their expertise so that they can have efficient use of their resources to further their mission. And then the third aspect of this is what I call the consulting at the intersection of faith and community, where using a more specific faith-based lens and my own church connections, working with communities of faith that are looking to bring affordable housing and other community development resources to their congregation, or trying to find the ways that their congregation can better help engender that work in their communities. And one of those right now that I have very thankful I get to work on is my church is working on developing one of our former buildings into housing for the formerly homeless. It's a long trek, but it's an important part of the affordable housing conversation. So what is affordable housing? because I think it has become more in the news, and I think especially pertinent to Charlotte the last few years. There are a lot of myths and perceptions that go with it. So at a baseline, when, especially for those who are sort of in the industry, we're talking about what is affordable. The simplest measure is it's housing that is affordable to individuals and families at their respective income levels, so that families are spending no more than 30% of income towards housing. That is a measure that sort of has been a long-standing benchmark within the affordable housing community, and is one that is used, if you think about, if you've been fortunate enough to go through the process of buying your own home, that roughly corresponds to sort of the allowed debt that a lender might look at that can go towards your housing payment. Depending upon specific programs, that can fluctuate. But roughly the idea is that if you're spending 30% or less of your monthly income towards housing, you're in a range where that you can afford other things, your grocery bills, your transportation, just other day-to-day items you need, gas for stuff for your car. But depending upon where you are in your job, as we'll look at different examples of that, that's not always the case. But as it is, housing prices in Charlotte are growing so fast that the cost burden with the number of people who are having to pay more than 30% of their income is steadily rising. So the first thing I wanted to share with today is, because this is kind of a very broad topic, and realizing there's only so much I can hit in approximately 25 minutes today, is to talk about the perceptions that go with the different types of affordable housing. Again, affordable housing is such a catch-all in that in one sense it does pertain just to what people put towards their income, but there are a lot of things, a lot of different types of housing that I know people think of when they hear these words. And so I've listed 6 different types, and I'm going to go through each one of these just to give you a little bit different flavor, because these are different parts of the housing continuum that our community really needs, I think, for everybody to not only survive, but really to thrive. Before I delve into each of those, I realize this slide, this is a lot of numbers here, but this will make a little more sense. And I want to highlight just kind of a couple here. So as we get into the next slides and I talk about affordability relative to area median income. So in Charlotte, according to HUD's analysis, the median family income for a family of 4, so again, this is adjusted for a family of 4, is the sort of common benchmark that HUD will use for metropolitan areas and at the state level. And they publish annually updates for what these income limits are, because this will dictate a lot of the programs that flow down from the federal government to the state, and then may even be managed at a city or municipality level. So for Charlotte in 2020, $83,500 was the median income for a family of 4. Then if you look at the chart below, this breaks it down to by household size. And these numbers, this is not the level of detail I will go into for each of these, but to give you a flavor of the fact that the average household size is not really a person of 4. It's probably closer to a 3-person household. You either have a single parent household with 1 or 2 children, or maybe you have a 2-person household, 2 adults with 1 child. But to get an idea of the types of incomes we're talking about when people are trying to meet affordability, that extremely low income for a 4-person, though, of $25,050, at the 50% income level, which is considered very low income. Again, I'm using HUD categories just to give you an idea of where these terms come from, $41,050. The 60% is very specific to a program, low-income housing tax credit. And when I talk about rental housing as part of the affordable housing spectrum, that's an important number to know, of $50,000. And then 80% of area median income, which traditionally has sort of been the top end of when people talk about affordable housing, goes up to $66,800. But in the last, I'd say probably 10 plus years, there's become an increasing focus on the idea of workforce housing, which is expanding that definition from affordable, which more often than not has gotten lumped into sort of your former public housing type of subset to include, has been expanded for the workforce part to include people that are, say, police officers, teachers, nurses, people working at restaurants. A lot of the people, and I'm thinking about folks at Advent, whether it's you've had those jobs or you have friends in those jobs, even if you're looking at these numbers, they are not coming up to where even these higher income levels at lower median incomes are. So it's 60% income, for example, at $50,000 a year, that's a household of four. So if I go over here to say a two-person household, $40,000. So if you're a single parent with a kid, and let's say you have a full-time job as a nurse, something, this is going to be closer to what you can afford. So I think one of the first stigmas I want to put out there and looking at these numbers is that people have to work against is the people who are trying to go for affordable housing, they aren't working. It is still, and maybe that's a hold off for being a Generation Xer growing up in the 80s, sort of the idea that somebody who is on the dole, on welfare, and they're getting a free ride. Well, the truth of the matter is they're having to work above and beyond, and as housing prices continue to rise, they can afford it less and less. Okay. I'm going to, sorry, I got to clear my annotations. Okay. So again, just to give a different flavor, and this is also to help people be aware when you're around town, and you've probably seen a number of these facilities that I'm going to show you today. And again, to give you an idea of the affordable housing continuum and the role that they play. So this first one talks about homeless shelters serving people less than 30% of the area median income. True, a lot of these cases, they're probably closer to 10% of the area median income, but they will, at the very high end, limit themselves there. There might be people who have jobs or they are job searching, but this is a picture of what's formerly known as the Men's Shelter of Charlotte, located in North Tryon, just near Uptown. And it's really intended to be a temporary facility that people who have been down on their luck, lost a job for whatever reason, can hopefully reestablish themselves, find some more footing, and then can graduate really on to maybe the next level of housing. For those who are wondering, though, if is a little bit of a commercial for them. So Men's Shelter of Charlotte is now known as Roof Above. If you've been around Charlotte for a while, there was the Urban Ministry Center, Men's Shelter of Charlotte. They actually merged in the last year, and that's their new name. So this picture predates that change. So as people are able to move from, let's say, out of homelessness, one, the affordable housing spectrum, there's an opportunity for what would be considered permanent supportive housing. This example on the left in Moore Place over in the Druid Hills neighborhood. And it provides an opportunity, as opposed to shelter, which is really temporary, people for long-term needs. Now, I would say this is an example of people who are really what a lot of the folks who work with them would consider the hardcore homeless. They may have mental health issues, developmentally disabled issues, could be dually diagnosed mental health and addictions. And so the reality is they're in a situation, they may be living on disability income, but it's their long-term home. And there are additional services provided with the work there. This other example, transitional housing, if you've driven down Park Road before, where the YWCA facility is, they provide this, and this is focused on women and women who have children, trying to help them get back on their feet. Some of them may have been in domestic violence situations, just as an example, but they are looking to reestablish themselves in the community. And the intent here is through the resources there that they could then further graduate to another level of housing. Public housing might be a place that some of them end up. Again, the idea is that it's a longer term. Again, at the 30% or less of area median income, well, if you're a two-person household, somebody making $25,000 per year, well, the minimum wage of 5 for the state. If you're working a full 40 hours a week, your annual salary is only going to come up to $14,500. You would have to be working essentially to get up to 30% AMI at that level, looking at between a 60 to 80 hour work week, depending upon your minimum income. So again, the public housing and the subsidized through the federal government funds that are passed through to help make this affordable. Another example of that, a sort of different subset where the public housing image I used was for families, is that for seniors. And the ranges, depending upon the housing, can go a greater swath of that affordable housing spectrum. But if you think of somebody who's retired, they've worked their whole life, and maybe they're living on disability or they're trying to live on Social Security, it's not a particularly large income. So the example here, this was a recently redone 2010 from a long-term former public housing property in the Cherry community. So although there's been gentrification of that neighborhood with a lot of new houses that would have easily priced out the seniors that live there, this was an opportunity for seniors to be able to stay in their community and yet find housing that was affordable. Oops. And then a couple of the others, if you continue to sort of go up the spectrum of things that maybe serve people in the 50 to 80% of area median income. The example on the left, just down the street from me, I live in Noda. I live on 37th Street, so I can see this pretty much every day. It was the old Noda Mills that had been changed into an affordable housing rental apartment. And then the example on the right is Habitat for Humanity. What really about the only entity that can play in the home ownership space, where all of the rest of these are rental and be in this income range. And then the last one, as we sort of graduate from the affordable housing to where the workforce comes in, the example I have here, if you maybe have seen in the news lately, Little Rock AME Zion Church in Uptown is in the process of actually starting a new development in conjunction with Laurel Street Residential, a for-profit affordable housing developer. And this is going to be a mixed income community. The idea that the mixed income is going to serve people at 30% or less of the area median income. So people already living in the neighborhood, and this way they don't have to be forced out. But it also brings in a mix of other incomes up to 80% AMI, and then even sort of the market rate. And there's a lot of research in the affordable housing world that's gone into some of the benefit of having mixed income communities so people aren't economically isolated. A couple of things I want to touch on, and I realize already this is going faster than I thought it would in terms of our time today, is why our community needs it. One of the things I wanted to pay attention to, besides just the fact that people are having a harder time, COVID comes into play in other ways to make the challenges grow even more as people have lost their jobs. But as we think about a lot of the racial justice issues that have hit Charlotte in the last few years, and you especially think of the Black Lives Matter movement during 2020, I want to just touch on some of the historical racial discrimination legacy that impacts people for generations. What I have here is a slide showing the example of redlining. So talk about government-backed discrimination in housing. The map that I have on my left, the one that's entitled From Charlotte, North Carolina, 1935. What this shows is the practice of redlining. And essentially, when the Federal Home Loan Mortgage Corporation was established in the 30s, and so therefore the ability to make longer term mortgages to make homeownership affordable, people in the federal government were trying to discern what are the areas that are worth sort of investing in. Well, what might not be readily obvious from here, but if you go back, the red and the yellow, if you can see through the grades, C, yellow, definitely declining, D, hazardous. Well, at the time, pretty much anything that was in those red areas were predominantly Black communities. The yellow would have also been, for those who live in Nodon around, if you can see some of this, mill areas. So low income, but primarily due to the racial segregation. And in some cases, if you go back and look at the old information, one might have tried to make the argument it was based upon, well, who really had the resources and could afford, but it was also clearly done based on race. And unfortunately, the legacy of that, which becomes generational, is people lack the opportunity to build some wealth based upon home ownership, still goes on to today. And the view I tried to show in the second hand is you can sort of see the overlay in some of the neighborhoods that would have been like the green and the blue and the better areas of, Myers Park, stuff to the south part of Charlotte, and that you can see around Uptown and the red areas as an example. Besides the racial legacy, though, then looking at why our community needs this and thinking of the housing. So if you go back to some of those slides I showed about, what are the income levels and that people need to be able to afford housing, and look at the types of jobs that people have. So this graph, and this, I give credit, I did not come up with this one. The city of Charlotte, through the Housing and Neighborhood Services and other local advocacy partners, I borrowed from a lot of their work. So in this case, if you look at the example here of the orange, the amount needed to be affordable for a 2-bedroom rental, if you go across this, people that we think of fit in that workforce housing, school teacher at 54,000. Well, one, you had to have been a seasoned school teacher in the Charlotte or North Carolina area. A lot of them are making less than this. Police officers are maybe just above that, the 2-bedroom rental, and then a carpenter, maybe above the 2-bedroom rental. Whereas other folks, nurses, aides, food prep, the hospitality industry, people in retail, they're not making sufficient income. There is a need of approximately 24,000 affordable housing units to help hit that group at 50% or below of the area median income. So they are only paying 30% or less of their income. There's a huge continual need. This next slide, I apologize that it's a little grainy, but I thought this was helpful. One of the things that this slide really helps to show is that even just 10 years ago, the number of units that were available at, say, $800 or less, just because of the natural age of property, before we've had this huge building boom, 50% of the property available in Charlotte might have had rent at $800 or less. 46% was above it, and there's a little gap for some others that don't quite fit. This goes back to 2018, and you can see where this now is flipped as a lot of new construction has come on board. 73% of the units are now above $800. Only 25% of the housing stock are less than $800. And that's only gotten worse as new construction continues to get built and the old stuff gets demolished. So as I'm getting the signal to wrap up, and again, this actually is good timing. So what can you do? And again, because I hopefully have time for maybe some questions. This is an initial primer. There's a lot more detail I could go into. So what I hopefully, as you look at these, can learn more about your neighborhoods. I'd encourage you to learn what housing is available in your respective neighborhoods, in your community. Get to understand the specific real estate market is there, because it matters not just for people to afford the housing, but as you think long-term around issues of racial justice and economic mobility. Start to learn so you can advocate for the housing variety. As I kind of went through that whole spectrum, that all of us are at different points in our life and have needs for different types of housing. And lastly, I will make the shameless plug, advocating for local funding, and that on our ballots, if you haven't already voted, don't already have your plan, but when you do, that we will have a chance as one of the bond measures on this year's ballot for the city to approve another $50 million for the Charlotte Housing Trust Fund. So I thank you for the time today. I apologize for throwing so much in there. There's more I'd love to get to.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rob. We're going to have to bring you back soon so that we can go even more in depth in some of those
topics.
That'll be
topics. 202.
Yes. And then a 302 and just the whole way there, because there's really so much information. It's such a complicated and critical issue. So we do have a few questions. I want to make sure that we can answer at least one or two. We're going to go over time a little, everybody. It's okay. We'll survive. So first, how do Charlotte's affordable housing options compare to other cities?
That's a great question. We are still, it is rapidly becoming more problematic. I'm trying to think of a short way to say this. Compared to your large coastal markets like a New York, a San Francisco, we are much more affordable and we have more options. But I think the thing that's most concerning about Charlotte and places like the Triangle, if you're in North Carolina, are the rate of change with which our affordable housing has been depleted. We have made a concerted effort to increase funds the last few years, but due to the growth, that the need for affordable housing is being far outstripped by the additional new housing that's being built that's at market rate. So I would say really, as much as that $50 million bond option is great, and it's only the second time we've had 50 millions come into play, it's probably about a third of what it needs to be for us to be able to make a continued long-term dent.
Absolutely. And you're bringing up the bond, you know what, we just passed this other 50 million bond, and I support bonds. I'm here for it. But what is the city doing with that money? Are they putting it to good use? Like, do you have an update for where we're at?
Right. So what the city has done with offering those funds, that they go into what the city calls the Housing Trust Fund. The nice thing that we're fortunate to have, where even though we have more of a need and we need to keep ramping it up, the philanthropic community and the corporate community has added in money as well. So there's also the Charlotte Housing, the short of it is CHOIF, CHOIF, and I'm going to butcher what it all means, has an additional $50 million. But the city is currently taking requests for proposals. And there's a local nonprofit, or there's a local office of a national nonprofit list who goes through a lot of those to sort of evaluate the need for those funds and local projects. And what they help to do is they usually are only a small slice, maybe 10 to 20% of the total budget, but it's really to help make the units available at 30% or less of the area median income, helping to further go to the lower income level. Because truthfully, just the combination of debt and equity in play, unless there's substantial subsidy, just doesn't go far enough. So the $50 million, the initial $50 million, I believe, has been almost completely allocated, and there are new projects in the mix. It will go fast.
Gotcha. Yeah. So I'm debating whether I should ask this question or hold it. I guess I'll just kind of ask it, maybe really, really quick answer, even though it's a long question. But your dad's a banker, or was a banker, and this is the banking capital. We have so much money here in Charlotte. Why are people homeless? Like, why doesn't everyone just have housing? That's a huge question.
It is a huge question, and I will try and give my 20,000 footish answer in the homeless. And I'm fortunate enough, my wife has worked long term on in homeless housing, more from the services side. So from the homeless perspective, as I think any of us, when we're looking to solve something like affordable housing, there are the resources that we bring to bear because they need scalable solutions that individuals just can't solve. And yet at the same time, you're trying to implement them for individuals. And so specifically, if you think of people who are homeless, and a lot of the people who are the hardcore long-term homeless have physical, mental, addictive challenges that go with it. And so you're not just dealing with solely a housing issue. For whatever reason, their own struggles, they may be their own barrier. They feel safer on the streets. I'm not saying that is the case across the board, but it definitely is in some cases. So the social aspect of what people have to overcome to be able to take advantage of housing is part of this. It's a both and scenario of, we need more housing, we need to be able to better build it, but then we need to try and figure out how we can better empower individuals to take hold of the resources that we want them to have.
Got it. Well, thank you so much, Rob, for your time today. If folks want to get in touch with you, if they want to learn more, what's the best way to do that?
Best way to do that, I'm gonna, you can see that right back on the screen real quick. LinkedIn right there, as I'm still sort of busy building out my consulting business. At this point, it's been more word of mouth on my clients. You can get in touch with me through LinkedIn. Easy to email me. And again, so it's Rob Hammock. You get my LinkedIn page. You can get a little more flavor of what I've done. I'd say I'd see you around the proverbial water cooler, hopefully sometime in 2021 and can do that. I've sort of stayed as an Advent member, but having to stay at home more often.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Rob. Yes, I'm at Advent, so I have my mask when I'm in the main space. It's definitely been good to see folks, but yes, to everyone's good health. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today for Advent Members Talks. I hope that you'll join us next week for our next presentation. And yeah, have a great evening.
Thank you.